Without further ado, please give a warm welcome to our keynote speaker, Ms. Michelle Alexander.
Can you hear me? Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me here tonight. I am just truly honored to be here and thrilled that so many of you are interested in hearing about not only the issues I raise in my book, The New Jim Crow, but also are here to support three strikes reform. Three strikes laws in the United States are among the most egregious examples of the get tough mania that has swept the United States in the past few decades. Other examples include, life without parole for juveniles. The notion that here in Washington State, someone would be sentenced to life without possibility of parole at the age of 13 is utterly unconscionable and virtually unthinkable anywhere else in the world. But here in the United States, many people shrug their shoulders at that remarkable fact. So what I want to talk about tonight is how we as a nation became the type of people who would throw away the key on people's lives at relatively young ages, kissing them goodbye for the rest of their lives, often for relatively minor crimes. How we as a nation became the kind of people that would target millions of people, primarily poor people of color, for drug offenses, often nonviolent offenses, brand them as felons, and then usher them into a permanent racial undercaste. Now, using a word like caste system or undercaste or racial undercaste, strikes many as, extreme or, nearly absurd today. Today we're constantly told in the media by media pundits and politicians that we as a nation have finally moved beyond race, that the election of Barack Obama represents our nation's triumph over race, and that his presidency marks, the final nail in the coffin of Jim Crow, the bookend placed on this history of racial caste in America. Well, my book is a direct challenge to that racial narrative. The idea that we as a nation have triumphed over race. I argue that racial caste is alive and well in America today. And that we as a people have not become colorblind, but rather blind to the realities of race in America. I'm well aware that the claims that I make in this book, that a racial caste system exists in the United States today, is hard for many people to swallow. It's particularly those who have never spent time in prison or been labeled a felon find it difficult to identify the parallels between mass incarceration and Jim Crow or earlier systems of racial control. And I myself, I admit, and in the introduction to my book, that I myself had a difficult time many years ago appreciating the magnitude of the harm caused by communities of color by mass incarceration. In the introduction to my book, I talk about how I first encountered the idea that we had a racial caste system in the United States while rushing to catch the bus while I was living in Oakland, California. And I was rushing to catch the bus, and I saw this bright orange poster, stapled to a telephone pole. And, it said on the poster in big bold print, the drug war is the new Jim Crow. And I remember stopping, pausing for a minute, kind of scanning the text of the flyer, and I saw that a small radical, group was holding a community meeting in a tiny church, a few blocks away, and they were organizing to protest the new 3 strikes law in California and police brutality and the expansion of the state's prison system. And I remember thinking to myself, yeah, the criminal justice system is racist in a lot of ways, but it doesn't help to make such absurd comparisons to Jim Crow. People just think you're crazy. And, I rushed, crossed the street, caught the bus headed on my way to my new job as director of the Racial Justice Project of the ACLU in Northern California. Now, when I joined the ACLU, I had been a civil rights lawyer and litigator for a number of years. I had been working in private practice representing victims of employment discrimination and large class action suits. We sued, Home Depot, public supermarkets, many Fortune 500 companies for race and gender bias. And, I understood well the ways in which unconscious bias and racial stereotyping can infect decision-making of all kinds at all levels of an organization with disastrous consequences. So, I thought to myself, when I, get to the ACLU, I'm just going to shift my attention from employment discrimination to criminal justice reform, and I'm going to work with, other lawyers and activists to root out racial bias wherever it might rear its ugly head in the criminal justice system. But by the time I left the ACLU, after working on racial profiling litigation, working on issues of police brutality, working in communities hard hit by mass incarceration, I came to the realization that I was wrong about the criminal justice system. It's not just another institution infected with racial bias, but a different beast entirely. And I came to the realization quite belatedly that mass incarceration now functions as a stunningly comprehensive and well-disguised system of racial control, analogous in many ways to Jim Crow. Now, I want to share with you a story about kind of how I came to my awakening. There were, countless experiences that I had along the way, but there was one man who truly opened my eyes. I was in the midst of, launching this racial profiling campaign, what we call the Driving While Black or Brown campaign that we launched in California and eventually spread nationwide. And we had sued the California Highway Patrol for racial profiling and its drug interdiction practices, and we were looking at the possibility of suing a number of other law enforcement agencies, police departments in California. And we had set up a hotline for people to call if they believed they had been targeted, stopped on the basis of race by the police. We put billboards in communities saying, if you believe you have been stopped by the police on the basis of race or been the victim of DWB, call this hotline number. We were overwhelmed with calls. In fact, the first night that the hotline number was announced on an evening news show, we received thousands of calls. Our system crashed temporarily. We had to get a new system to expand our capacity. So we were in the process of going through these hotline calls. When people would call in, we'd send out a form for people to fill out, describing their experience, would come back in, and we were looking for potential spokespeople and plaintiffs in litigation. And I was spending one afternoon interviewing people, one after another, people who had sent compelling stories of discrimination by the police. And this one young African-American man comes in and hands me this stack of notes. And he has detailed his encounters with the police over about a 6-month period of time. He had names of police officers, witnesses, dates, times, locations. He's telling his story of being stopped repeatedly in a neighborhood in Oakland that we knew was, the site of a crackdown by law enforcement. And he describes what it was like to feel humiliated, constantly being told to step out of his car, made to lay face down on the pavement, story after story. And I said, my God, this is fantastic. Few people have documented their encounters with the police with this much precision. And I was excited about his story, and we're talking, and then he says something that makes me ask, oh, did you say you were convicted of a felony? And he pauses for a minute, and then he says, yeah, I was convicted of a drug felony. And I said, oh, I am so sorry, but we are not going to be able to represent you. We're not going to be able to use you as a spokesperson or a named plaintiff, because if we use someone who has been convicted of a felony, all the media attention and all the focus of law enforcement will go on your criminal history, and we won't be able to have a conversation or a policy debate about police practices. All the focus and the argument will be about why it makes sense for the police to focus on people like you, people with criminal records. So I'm sorry, we're not going to be able to use it. He stands up and he starts yelling at me, saying, you're doing to me just what the police are doing. You're not listening to me once I told you that I'm a felon. How many people do you think are left in my neighborhood that they haven't gotten to yet? How many young black men in my neighborhood you think they haven't labeled already? They've gotten to us already. That's what I'm trying to tell you. He's like, I can't get a job because I've been branded a felon. I got no place to live. He's like, they've gotten us to us all, and there's nothing we can do. We're trapped. And I just kept apologizing. I'm sorry, but it's just not going to work for us to use you as a spokesperson. He starts grabbing the notes, ripping them into shreds. I can't believe I trusted you. I thought you were different. I can't believe I trusted you. Ripping up the paper, yelling at me, turning around, marches out the door, catches an elevator, and disappears. Well, several months later, I'm in his neighborhood doing a public access television show because we were in the process of trying to organize a couple thousand people to go to the California state capitol to protest Governor Gray Davis's refusal to sign racial profiling legislation. And we had been holding town halls up and down the state, organizing against racial profiling, and doing a tremendous amount of organizing and grassroots work. And after the public access show ends, and it was being broadcast live, he comes bursting in through the door, the studio, bursting in. He's carrying this dirty potted plant. And he runs up to me, he shoves this potted plant in my arms, and he's clearly emotional, and he says, I just come in to tell you, I'm sorry. I am sorry. I'm sorry. I see that you're working hard. I see that you're trying to help folks like me. And he turns around and runs out the door. I chase after him, and he disappears into a broke-down car, speeds off. Now, what I failed to mention is that in my first meeting with him, when I told him I'm sorry I couldn't represent him, he had started to tell me about how actually drugs had been planted on him, and the police were trying to frame him and beat him and his friend up in the process, and I hadn't really believed him. Well, a couple months after that, I open up the newspaper, and what do I see? A story about the Oakland Riders police scandal, where a gang of police officers were roaming his neighborhood, planting drugs on suspects, beating them up, and who is the number one officer named in that scandal but the officer he had identified to me as the one who had planted drugs on him and beat him up. And I thought, he's right. He's right. I am no better than him. No better than them, the police. The minute he told me he was a felon, I stopped listening. I didn't believe him. I did not give him a chance. And as a result, I never had the opportunity to hear his full story and possibly help him. I do not know where he is today. I don't know what has become of him. I know that he snatched that potted plant off of his grandmother's front porch and gave it to me because he was still living with her. But I stopped listening. And I realized that in my own advocacy as a civil rights lawyer, I was replicating many of the forms of discrimination that these folks face in the community all the time. And that was the beginning of my journey, and I started asking hard questions. Why is it that they've gotten to everybody in his community already? Why is it that they're already all branded at young ages? What is really going on? And as I began my research and my study, what I learned was appalling. There are more African Americans under correctional control today, in prison or jail, on probation or parole, than were enslaved in 1850, a decade before the Civil War began. In 2004, there were more African American men disenfranchised as a result of felon disenfranchisement laws than in 1870, the year the 15th Amendment was ratified, prohibiting the denial of the right to vote explicitly on the basis of race. And in some major urban areas, if you count prisoners, if you take into account prisoners, some major urban areas, more than half of all working age African American men have criminal records and are thus subject to legalized discrimination for the rest of their lives. In cities like Chicago, more than nearly 80% of working age African American men have criminal records. Now, these men are part of a growing undercaste, not class, caste, a lower caste of people defined largely by race who can be legally discriminated against in virtually every aspect of economic, social, and political life, denied the very same rights that we supposedly won during the civil rights movement. Which leads me to the basic thesis of my book. I argue that what has changed since the collapse of Jim Crow has less to do with the basic structure of our society than the language we use to justify it. In the era of colorblindness, it is no longer socially permissible to use race explicitly as a justification for discrimination, exclusion, and social contempt. So we don't. Rather than rely on race, we use our criminal justice system to label people of color criminals and then engage in all the practices that we supposedly left behind. Today, it is perfectly legal to discriminate against criminals in nearly all the ways that it was once legal to discriminate against African Americans. Once you're labeled a felon, all the old forms of discrimination, employment discrimination, housing discrimination, denial of the right to vote, automatic exclusion from juries, denial of public benefits, exclusion from education, suddenly legal. As a criminal, you scarcely have more rights and arguably less respect than a black man living in Alabama at the height of Jim Crow. We have not ended racial caste in America, we have merely redesigned it. Now, I find that when I tell people that I think that mass incarceration amounts to a new Jim Crow, I'm frequently met with this shocked disbelief. People say, how can you say that? Just look at Barack Obama. Just look at Oprah Winfrey. Just look at Colin Powell. Just look at, the list goes on of, highly visible, powerful or wealthy African Americans who have made it. And this list of names is intended to prove that racial caste couldn't possibly exist in America. But the fact that some African Americans are doing extremely well in the United States today doesn't mean that a racial caste system no longer exists. No caste system in the United States has ever governed all African Americans. There have always been free blacks and black success stories, even during slavery and Jim Crow. During slavery, there were some black slave owners. Not many, but some. And during Jim Crow, there were some black lawyers and black doctors, not many, but some. The extraordinary nature of individual black achievement today in formerly white domains certainly suggests that the old Jim Crow is dead. but it doesn't necessarily mean the end of racial caste. If history is any guide, it may have simply taken a different form. Any honest observer of American racial history, I think, has to acknowledge that the rules and reasons the legal system employs for enforcing status relations of any kind, they evolve and they change as they're challenged. I spend the first chapter of my book talking about the cyclical rebirths of caste in America. After the collapse of slavery, a system of convict leasing emerged to replace plantation labor. So, after slavery collapsed, what happened? African American men were targeted by the police for very minor crimes like loitering, rounded up en masse, sent to prison, and then leased back to plantations where the idea was that they were going to earn their freedom, work to try to pay back the plantation owner the costs of their clothes and food and shelter. But the catch was they could never earn enough to pay back what they supposedly owed to the plantation owner. And so they were enslaved again in perpetuity. Slavery by Another Name. Douglas Blackman wrote a fantastic book called Slavery by Another Name that talks about the rise of convict leasing in the United States to replace the institution of slavery. Convict leasing was a backlash against the fall of slavery. And then as convict leasing began fading away, what happened? Well, blacks and whites began, for the first time, former slaves and their descendants began organizing together for economic justice in a populist movement that was sweeping the South during the Agrarian Depression. And how was that populist movement, interracial populist movement, crushed? By proposing Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws were proposed as a deliberate effort to bust open that emerging coalition by disenfranchising African Americans and appealing to the racism and anxieties of whites and get them to turn against their former allies. And it worked like a charm. And soon, politicians began competing with each other. Politicians across the political spectrum began competing with each other to pass ever harsher and absurd Jim Crow laws, each trying to prove who could be tougher on them, the black and brown folks who are now, once again, being viewed and portrayed as inferior to justify a new system of control that would serve the political and economic interests of the white elite. And Jim Crow was born. Well, today, our system of mass incarceration is traceable to a very similar political dynamic. Now, we've gotten used to mass incarceration in this country to a certain degree, but it is a brand new phenomenon. In the past few decades, our prison population has quintupled. We went from a prison population of about 300,000 to more than 2 million in the space of just a couple of decades. No, in fact, if we were to go back to the rates of incarceration we had in the 1970s, a time, by the way, when many civil rights activists thought that rates of incarceration were just egregiously high. But if we were going to go back to those bad old days in the 1970s, we would have to release 4 out of 5 people who are in prison today. More than 1 million people employed by the criminal justice system would lose their jobs. That's how enormous and deeply entrenched, kind of in the economic fabric of our country, this system has become in an incredibly short period of time. But it's the racial dimension, in my view, that it's the most striking feature. No other country in the world incarcerates such a large percentage of its racial and ethnic minorities, not even South Africa at the height of its apartheid. In some cities, take Washington, D.C., for example, our nation's capital. In Washington, D.C., it was estimated several years ago that 3 out of 4 black men and nearly all those in the poorest neighborhoods could expect to serve time in prison. Rates of incarceration nearly as shocking can be found in other cities across America. Now, most people assume that this vast expansion of our prison system is due to crime rates, right? They say, oh, well, the prisons have expanded dramatically because of, rampant crime, increases in crime rates. Not so. Not so. Over the past 30 years, crime rates have fluctuated, gone up and down, and today are actually at historical lows. But incarceration rates have consistently soared. Most sociologists and criminologists today agree that crime rates and incarceration rates have moved independently of one another. Incarceration rates have consistently soared regardless of whether crime has gone up or down. So if incarceration rates aren't driven by crime rates, what is it been driven by? Well, it turns out that those activists who posted that sign on that telephone pole were right. The war on drugs is the primary driver of mass incarceration in the United States today. Nearly 2/3 of the increase in the federal system and more than half of the increase in the state system has been due to drug convictions. Drug convictions have increased more than 1,000% since the drug war began. And for those who might think that the drug war has been focused on rooting out, drug kingpins, no. Yeah, think again. In 2005, for example, 4 out of 5 drug arrests were for simple possession, only 1 out of 5 for sales. Most people in state prison for drug offenses today have no history of violence or significant selling activity. And in the 1990s, which was the period of the greatest expansion of the drug war, nearly 80% of the increase in drug arrests were for marijuana possession. A drug now widely believed to be less harmful than alcohol or tobacco, and is at least as prevalent in middle-class, suburban white communities on college campuses as it is in communities of color. But the drug war has been waged almost exclusively in poor communities of color, resulting in an exponential increase in the number of young people who are often branded at very early ages as felons and find themselves trapped in a permanent underclass, cycling in and out of prison, often for the rest of their lives. Now, I want to get back to how this drug war began and the roots of mass incarceration. Because like I said, they're very similar to the roots of Jim Crow. Most people think that the drug war was declared in response to rising drug crime or the emergence of crack cocaine in inner city communities in the United States. Again, not so. The current drug war, the one we have today, was officially declared by President Ronald Reagan in 1982 at a time when drug crime was actually on the decline, not on the rise. It was a couple years before crack first hit the streets in Los Angeles and later spread to inner cities across America. The drug war, from at the outset, had relatively little to do with drug crime. It was driven by racial politics. The drug war was part of the Republican Party effort to appeal to poor and working class white voters who were fearful of, resentful of many of the gains of the civil rights movement, particularly desegregation, busing, and affirmative action. And Republican Party strategists and pollsters discovered that they could be highly successful even in an era of so-called color blindness where you could no longer use explicitly racist political appeals. They could be highly successful in appealing to those racial fears and anxieties among poor and working class whites by using racially coded political rhetoric on crime and welfare. And they could attract those voters, persuade them to defect from the Democratic Party and join the Republican Party by promising to get tough on crime and to crack down on welfare dependency. And by promising to get tough and crack down on a community that everyone understood was defined by race, the Republican Party was able to persuade an enormous number of formerly white Democrat voters to join the Republican Party. And when President Ronald Reagan declared the drug war, it was his effort to make good on campaign promises to crack down on a people who had not so subtly been defined by race. And they got lucky, because a couple of years after the drug war was declared, crack appeared on the scene. First emerging in LA and later spreading to cities across America. And the Reagan administration actually hired staff whose job it was to publicize crack babies, crack whores, crack dealers in inner city communities, and crack-related violence. They fed the media. Their job, these publicists' job, was to feed the media stories about crack abuse, addiction, and related violence in inner city communities, and an effort to make inner city drug use and drug crime a media sensation, an effort to bolster public support for the war, and an effort to turn what had been a rhetorical war into a literal one. Plan worked like a charm. Almost overnight, television sets were saturated with images of black and brown drug users and dealers. Many people in this room might be too young to remember that, in the mid and late 1980s, early 1990s, every time you turned on your television set for the evening news, you saw black men in handcuffs. Black men in handcuffs for some drug-related offense. Those images, the racial imagery associated with the drug war in those early years, forever changed our conception about who drug users and dealers are. Studies have now shown consistently for decades that, contrary to popular belief, people of color are no more likely to use or sell illegal drugs than whites. Or sell. That defies the basic racial stereotype today about drug dealers. You think about a drug dealer, or what you see in the media is a drug dealer is a black kid standing on the street corner with his pants sagging down. Well, plenty of drug dealing happens in the ghetto, but it happens everywhere else in America as well. A white kid in rural Nebraska does not drive to the hood to get his marijuana or his meth. He's able to buy it from his buddy down the road. Drug dealing happens in every community, of every race, of every class in the United States, but the drug war has been concentrated in poor communities of color. And the war on drugs and the get tough mentality that goes with it ushered in a wave of 3 strikes legislation. The get tough mentality brought us 3 strikes, life without parole for children, and the types of sentences that are absolutely unheard of anywhere else in the world. You talk about, I should qualify that, any other Western democracy in the world, because you can find authoritarian regimes who will throw away people for the rest of their lives for relatively minor crimes or execute them. But in Western democracies, what we do here in America is absolutely unheard of. There are people, doing life sentences for marijuana possession. You go to Europe, talk to people in France, and tell them that, and they look at you like you're crazy. In most other Western democracies, if people do time at all for drug offenses, it's measured in weeks or maybe months, rarely years, and certainly not decades. Yeah, but here in America, that's become commonplace. And the reason it's become commonplace and the reason it's become so easily acceptable is because we have demonized black and brown people and dehumanized them, making it possible for us to do to them what would be absolutely unthinkable to someone we actually cared about. And that's the root. That's the root of this new system of control. And it's the root of every racial caste system that has ever existed in the United States or anywhere else around the world, which is the failure to care across racial lines. You know, Martin Luther King Jr. at the end of his life reminded his audiences over and over again that slavery and Jim Crow, systems, they weren't actually based on racial hostility. They were based on indifference. They're based on indifference. Yes, there were some, who were hostile and horribly bigoted, but most people are good people who can't bring themselves to care about people of another race the same way they would care for one of their own. And that failure to care, to extend the same care, compassion, and concern to someone of another race, to a kid who looks like he's from the hood, that you would extend to your own child. Or imagine, is deserving that a child in a upper middle class white neighborhood might deserve. That failure to care and extend the same care and compassion and concern, that is the root of this new system of control. And until we're able to inspire some measure of care, compassion, and concern for everyone, every human being of every race, no matter who they are or what they have done, mass incarceration as a system of control will continue to function well for a very long time. Now, I'm told by many that, I should be encouraged by the fiscal crisis sweeping states, small and large, and the fact that many states are now rethinking, these harsh, lengthy sentences because, it's too expensive. It's too expensive now for us to keep all these folks locked up. And, Governor Schwarzenegger had this revelation that maybe the money that was being channeled to prisons might be better spent on schools or crumbling infrastructure or something else, right? But I am worried that we may become satisfied with relatively minor reform, because tinkering with this system is not enough. It's not enough. Like I said, if we were to return even to the incarceration rates that we had in the 1970s, we'd have to release 4 out of 5 people out of prison. Prisons across America would have to close. Many rural communities are now dependent on prisons, the way some rural communities were once dependent on plantations in the South, source of their economic base. If we really try to shrink this system back down to a size anything close to sanity, it's going to take a broad-based social movement. The kind of resistance that we will face in trying to dismantle the system be profound. So we've got to step out of this mindset that we just need to tinker with this law, or tinker with that law. No, what we need to do is to build a movement to end mass incarceration in the history of caste in America. Now, I want to talk just for 1 minute about a few of the parallels between mass incarceration and Jim Crow, in my view, and then I want to open it up for some discussion and questions and conversation. Jim Crow, as we know, was a system of rules, laws, customs, policies that operated to lock African Americans into a permanent second-class status by law. Well, ask yourself if some of these rules and laws that apply to those branded felons, remind you of a bygone era. Well, first, denial of the right to vote. Now, I am thrilled that Washington State has now become one of the few states in the United States that allows prisoners to vote as a result of a Ninth Circuit decision striking down the ban on voting in prisons. And that as a result of courageous legislative action, people are entitled to the right to vote after they've been released. But what exists here doesn't exist everywhere. And in 47 states in the District of Columbia, prisoners are denied the right to vote, and even once you're released from prison, you can be denied the right to vote for a period of years or the rest of your life. About 1 in 8 African American men, are disenfranchised in the United States. In some communities, figures more like 1 in 4 black men permanently disenfranchised as a result of felon disenfranchisement laws. So the denial of the right to vote, basic right in a democracy, and one denied during the Jim Crow era is denied again to a huge percentage of the African American community as a result of mass incarceration. Employment discrimination, perfectly legal once you've been branded a felon. Employment applications, ranging from McDonald's clerk to accountant, got that box on the application. You got to check if you've ever been convicted of a felony. Surveys indicate that about 70% of employers refuse to hire, won't even consider hiring someone convicted of a drug felony. Now, if you've been convicted of a violent felony, any violent felony, that figure plummets to less than 7% of employers are even willing to consider giving you a job, right? So, here you are, branded a felon, released from prison, got to check that box on employment applications, and then get this. Thousands of professional licenses are off limits to you if you've been branded a felon. Some states you can't even get a license to be a barber if you've been branded a felon. Housing discrimination, perfectly legal. Public housing projects as well as, private landlords, not only are they free to discriminate, but by federal law, you are banned from public housing for a minimum of 5 years upon your release from prison with a felony. Back in the Jim Crow era, there was racially restrictive covenants. Today, anyone branded a felon, automatically excluded from public housing. Where are folks supposed to go? In fact, relatives of former prisoners risk losing their public housing if they even allow a returning prisoner to stay with them. Risk eviction. Public benefits. Food stamps, federal food stamps are off limits to you if you've ever been convicted of a drug felony. You are denied food stamps for life if you've been caught with drugs and caught a felony. Pregnant women, people with HIV and AIDS, no job, no housing, hungry, maybe sick, no food stamps. Now, what are folks expected to do? What are folks expected to do? Well, it turns out what they're expected to do in many states is pay back thousands of dollars in fees, fines, court costs, accumulated back child support, as well as the cost of their imprisonment. Some states now, when you're released, you're expected to pay back the cost of your imprisonment. And up to 100% of your wages can be garnished to pay back these fees, fines, court costs, back child support. So here you are, one of the lucky few. You actually managed to get a job, and up to 100% of your wages can be garnished? What is the system designed to do? Send you right back to prison, which is what, in fact, happens about 70% of the time. 70% of released prisoners return within 3 years, and the majority of those who return do so in a matter of months, because the challenges associated with making it on the outside are so severe. I learned today about a three-striker who in 2006 caught his third strike. How? By stealing $50 worth of groceries from a grocery store and shoving somebody on their way out. So there are 3 strikes. Third strike. That's somebody trying to survive. Trying to get some groceries. Lock them up, throw away the key for the rest of their life. Other parallels to Jim Crow, exclusion from jury service. Of course, one of the hallmarks of the Jim Crow era was the automatic exclusion of African Americans from juries, the all-white juries, particularly in the South. Well, all-white juries have been making a comeback, a roaring comeback in many areas of the country. Why? Because felons are deemed ineligible for jury service, automatically excluded. And then, if you have ever had a negative experience with law enforcement, you are deemed incapable of being impartial in a criminal case and can be removed for cause from a jury. Now, good luck finding many African Americans, particularly in poor communities of color today, who have not yet had a negative experience with law enforcement that might result in their disqualification from a jury. So the all-white juries have made a comeback. But as bad as all these formal barriers, political and economic exclusion are, many people that I have worked with over the years around these issues who have been branded felons tell me that it's actually not these laws and rules that are the worst of it, that it's actually the stigma that's the most difficult to bear. The stigma of being branded a criminal or branded a felon. It's the shame and stigma associated with criminality in the era of mass incarceration that it's the hardest to bear. It's not just the denial of the job or the denial of housing, but the look that flashes across the employer's face when he sees that box has been checked. It's not just the denial of housing, but having to beg your grandma for a place to sleep at night because nowhere else will take you in. It's that shame and stigma that causes so many people, branded felons, to try to pass. Right? During the Jim Crow era, light-skinned blacks tried to pass as white to avoid the shame, stigma, and of race and of discrimination, during the Jim Crow era. Well, today, people branded felons try to pass. They lie not just to employers and to housing officials, but also to their friends, family, loved ones. There's a shame associated with criminality that has created a silence, even in the communities hardest hit by mass incarceration. In fact, there's a fascinating study that was done by an ethnographer in Washington, D.C., and it resulted in a book called Doing Time on the Outside. And in this book, they studied, an area in Washington, D.C. that was hard hit by mass incarceration, neighborhood where, every apartment or every other house had someone who was either currently behind bars, who had recently been released from prison. Neighborhoods where you would think that mass incarceration in prison was just thought to be normal, no big deal. But even in these neighborhoods hardest hit by mass incarceration, they were unable to find one person who had fully come out to their friends, neighbors, coworkers, or loved ones about their own criminal status or the status of their loved ones. This shame has created a deep silence that it's time that we break. So it is time for us to begin speaking up and speaking out and telling the truth about this system of control. And while everyone who has committed a crime needs to accept responsibility for what they've done, and mind you, everyone in this room has committed a crime. We are all guilty of something. No one here is an innocent. But after accepting responsibility for what you have done, you need to shake off that shame and get about the business of building the movement that will end mass incarceration and the history of racial caste in America. Thank you very much.